Hello! In this series, it's been established that there are good reasons to think that the Corinthians would have wanted to check out Paul's claims that there were 500 witnesses to the resurrection. But could they even do that? It would require a great deal of traveling for those in Corinth to seek out witnesses of resurrection appearances in Jerusalem. Fortunately, the early church was addicted to traveling. Larry Hurtado points out that, quote, "A well-attested networking was another feature of early Christianity. This involved various activities, among them the sending and exchange of texts, believers traveling for translocal promotion of their views, representatives sent for conferral with believers elsewhere, or sent to express solidarity with other circles of believers. Travel and communication were comparatively well developed in the Roman world generally, among wealthy and a good many ordinary people, for business, pilgrimage to religious sites or occasions, for health, to consult oracles, for athletic events, sightseeing, and other purposes. In that world of frequent travel and communication, the early Christians particularly seem to have been given to networking, devoting impressive resources of time, money, and personnel to this, and on a wide translocal scale." Unquote. So, the early church definitely knew how to get around. In fact, each year, Jewish Christians would have also visited Jerusalem from all over for Jewish festivals, so that you would have a bunch of Christians in one place at one time. That would be really convenient if you were looking for a couple hundred eyewitnesses. But you might worry that despite this frequent traveling, the Corinthians don't have nearly enough information to start an investigation. Remember, here's what Paul has to say about the 500 witnesses. "Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." Fortunately, as Dr. Loke points out, the fact that there is so little information presented in this passage actually indicates the Corinthians had access to more information that we don't.
The Christians in Corinth or anywhere else, they would not have believed based on the scanty information in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8 alone.
Therefore, Loke speculates that this vague reference points to a rich, detailed account in events or traditions we no longer have access to.
This passage in 1 Corinthians 15 must have been a summary of traditional resurrection narratives which were told in fuller forms elsewhere.
A form of
Dalmok and Jalad at Tanagra,
as it were. Note that Loke uses must have been a summary, not might have been a summary. Why must it be? Because otherwise they wouldn't have had enough information to verify the 500. But since their ability to verify the 500 is the claim we're investigating, then Loke is engaged in circular logic, begging the question and assuming the conclusion.
Oh, hi, Paulogia. So you're characterizing Loke's argument as, if 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 wasn't a summary of fuller accounts, then the Corinthians couldn't have checked out the eyewitnesses. But the Corinthians could have checked out the eyewitnesses, therefore 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 was a summary of fuller accounts. Well, let's be very clear, this silly argument isn't what Loke is presenting. Here, let's explain Loke's argument with an analogy. Say you find a random phone on the ground. You pick it up and read the notification on it. Sally texted saying, "Hello, Steve. Can you please pick up the kids from school? Love you." What would be the reasonable inference to draw from reading this text? Imagine this complaint. "Sally is being ridiculous. She never specified which kids are to be picked up, nor the address of the school in question. How can poor Steve be expected to launch an investigation on the basis of such scanty information?" Well, that's a silly complaint. Just by reading this, you can tell that Sally and Steve obviously have talked before, and the information they've previously shared with each other would allow Steve to make perfect sense of this. Maybe Sally and Steve are married, and because they have this relationship, it would be very clear to Steve which kids and school Sally is referencing. Hopefully you can see the important point. We can come across a message that, on its own, isn't actually enough to start an investigation. However, this message, based on its context, the way it's structured, and the relationship between the sender and the receiver, tells us that there was already knowledge common to both parties that would make such an investigation possible. Dr. Loke argues that Paul's offhand mention of the 500 witnesses is such a message, which makes sense. Paul was writing to the Corinthians, who he had close relations with and assumed responsibility for them. They no doubt would have wanted to know more about these 500 witnesses and ask questions. Furthermore, Paul's referencing them would be really, really weak if all the Corinthians knew about them was what Paul provides in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6. As New Testament scholar Birger Gerhardsen remarks concerning 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 8, elementary psychological considerations tell us that the early Christians could scarcely mention such intriguing events without being able to elaborate on them. Before we go, let's look at one last objection.
In that email exchange with Capturing Christianity, Dr. Allison also wrote, if the Corinthians knew any of these people, why didn't Paul write, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, including your friends Faustinus and Vitus, although some have died, or some such. I just thought that was funny.
In reply, if there were really fuller explanations given to the Corinthians, if they had accounts of who these witnesses were and such details, then there would have been no need to mention these witnesses by name. I mean, he could, if he wanted to, but he didn't have to. So, all things considered, Paul's reference to the Corinthians being so short paradoxically gives us more reason to think that the Corinthians were able to search out these eyewitnesses. That, considered along with the frequent traveling in the early church, gives us a strong case that not only would the Corinthians wanted to have searched out the eyewitnesses, but they could do that. Hey, the case this series is presenting is really starting to shape up. But that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this content.